so we should be good there.
And she's like,
No,
Because I haven't seen it in a little bit, but and for whatever reason,
and they've got that whole
for a second,
yeah.
you should turn on and back like
Yeah.
That's fine. It's not been doing it recently, but don't let it like panic.
No, that's fine, that's fine, that's all right.
Oh, yeah.
You should be good.
Okay, perfect.
It's a nice space, and it breathes.
That's my cookies over it.
No, it's the library. The downtown library. This is Sloan.
Yeah.
So now we have that West orange word, and I guess it still is.
Well, we went to Main Street.
Yes. So they rented it for us. Yeah.
Do you know what it does seem like it's
What's that? I gave him 2 minutes.
Yes, please do. I don't know. I would be mine.
Yeah, I did give it to him. I recognize it. She may forget. I also found out my mother. They gave her cash.
Meeting space.
I can almost.
I'd already finished eating all the food.
You can ask her that.
And then the money she has.
We worked with them for a band that doesn't make sense. So great having them next door. It makes sense.
Well, our students did, they were doing gaming again this year.
Did it go well?
Good, good.
Yes.
I missed it.
We couldn't do it.
We had so much going on.
He loves you guys. He just is such a mind.
Yes, we encourage it.
Should be. We just love her.
We highly encourage it.
Young to know anything.
It's good.
No, it is. It's just sparkling. If they want.
You're a little son. It's like your church. Excuse me, you're not you.
exactly?
I was like, oh my gosh, in my mind, I'm like,
Oh my gosh, it's not so and so. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's not was and then want me to. There's someone else over here.
yes, that'll be it.
It's safe.
We have a speaker April 3rd, and then we have a trio, jazz trio coming in on Sunday. I know, Monday evening. Then we'll have another music.
So it's worth taking days.
Get out here every chance. Do you know Dr. Barker?
Yeah.
Dr. Barker?
There.
He's the long He's our every place we go. Well, he knows he's I know nothing. I know just enough to get myself in trouble. I'm at the library. I'm on Main Street. I've been here 3.5 years. Have you been to the library in town?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. This is, I believe, 4 o'clock, right? And I'm Mahbubul Kabir from Business and Econ program, and I'm really pleased to introduce Quamrul Ashraf. He's the professor at Williams College in Massachusetts. It's a very small private liberal arts college like ours, and he's also chairing that Center for Development Economics. So he's our today's speaker. So please welcome Ashraf.
Thanks, Dr. Kabir. I've had a really exciting day here. It's been a wonderful visit. A lot of stimulating discussions with students and faculty. It's been had spent a beautiful afternoon outside enjoying the campus. So it's been quite an enchanting day. And I'm hoping to maybe pay some of that back, with the next 45 minutes sharing with you all some of the things that I spend a lot of time thinking about, in part because it's really my intellectual passion. So much of what I'll be talking about, actually all of what I'll be talking about in the next 45 minutes or so, and depending upon sort of how I end up spending time on certain things versus others, we might finish a little earlier than 45 minutes, we might go a little over, but I'll try my best to leave as much time for discussion and Q&A. Much of what I'm going to be talking about today is based on my recently published textbook with David Weil at Brown University, and it's a textbook that basically talks about economic growth, sort of the process through which nations and economies as a whole, generate improvements in living standards over time. Okay, and so it's a really sort of a big topic, a topic that sort of dates back to the very inception of economics as a scientific discipline. So it's right there in the title of the founding father of economics, I think, considered by many to be Adam Smith, and Adam Smith's kind of famous book, on the origins of the wealth of nations, really speaks to this particular topic about what are the roots of economic prosperity for nations as a whole, and as a corollary to that, what are the sources of the inequalities, economic inequalities that we see across nations. My plan for today's talk is to sort of give you guys a sort of rather than going into sort of there's a lot of technicalities and mathematical modeling and kind of data work and econometrics and statistical work that goes behind what I'm going to be discussing today. But rather than going into all of those kind of the nitty-gritty details, my objective is to really give you guys a broad overview of the state of thinking in the field, and really the state of the data that we have that tells us what is the state of global inequality across the world. And what are the forces that have given rise to global inequality, to big differences in living standards across countries, and what can be done about those forces? Can we take action as a matter of policy, both in the developed world, but also in the developing world, in lower income countries, in order to address some of the vast inequities in living conditions that we observe. So I'm going to start with talking about the state of global inequality today, and give you guys a taste of where it comes from. And then I'll spend much of today's talk, of the rest of the talk, talking about the forces that we think that decades of research in economic growth have shown the forces that have been identified as being important sources of global disparities across countries. Okay, so where are we with global inequality, and how did we get here? So it's often said that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So going by that exchange rate, this slide should be worth at least 2,000. So what this picture, it's a picture that when I was sort of choosing these pictures for the introductory chapter of my textbook, and I asked my son, so what do you make of this picture, of these two pictures? And he said, well, it seems like the story that it's saying is that little humans do little human things, but they do so under very, very different circumstances. And this is, this image itself should be immediately telling of the vast inequities that characterize the world we live in. So the picture here is on the right is a picture of children playing in Lower Manhattan, sort of the World Financial Center there in the background. The picture on the left is a group of children playing in what's called the Kibera slum in Nairobi, Kenya. Okay? Again, little humans doing little human things, but under radically different conditions. So now it's clear just from the picture that these are there are deep differences in material well-being, okay, between these two places. But the question that we ask as economists, as I as a growth economist ask to get going with trying to make sense of this picture and whether something can be done about maybe closing the gap in living conditions between these two places, is, well, can we actually quantify this? Is there a quantitative something measurable that we can first get at in order to then kind of think about what gives rise to these differences in that measure, and then start thinking about policies about how to address these gaps. So the measure that economists think about when quantifying living conditions in a given nation is GDP per capita. Now, what is GDP, or gross domestic product? You want to think about it as GDP is basically the total value of all goods and services that are produced or consumed in an economy over the course of a year. Okay, so it's basically you can take all the expenditures that people had in the economy on consumption goods, on capital goods, on government's expenditures on roads and bridges and teacher salaries and so on in the public school system, and you can take the expenditures of the foreign sector, namely expenditures undertaken by foreigners on domestically produced goods, in order to get a sense of the total expenditures on goods and services that were produced in the US economy, for instance. Now, those expenditures obviously translate into income, okay, for the place where that stuff was all produced, okay, and so that's total GDP is basically capturing total expenditures on domestically produced goods, which translates into total income, okay, for the entire economy. So in order to get to a measure of living conditions, basically take total income and divide it by the population, and you come up with a measure called GDP per capita. Okay, and now if that measure is getting towards the right measure of differences in living conditions, then we should see that GDP per capita in a country like the US should be decidedly much higher than GDP per capita in a country like Kenya. And indeed, that's what we see. So here is a world map, color shaded according to the GDP per capita bracket of different nations. So nations that are in blue and in deeper blue are nations with higher GDP per capita. So the richest nations of the world are in Western Europe and Northern Europe. And they're also represented by what is often referred to by growth economists and economic historians as the neo-Europes, okay, or the Western offshoots, namely US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Okay, so these are places that weren't natively European, but they established institutions very much in the image of Western and Northern Europe. The other rich countries are the oil-producing nations, and the wealth of those nations are coming mostly from natural resources. But the countries that are shaded in green, and the lighter you go in green, are the countries that are poorer. And the lighter you are in green, the poorer you are. Right? The lower is your GDP per capita. So you might look at a picture like this and say that, well, here's the US. It's deep blue. The deep blue has a coding of more than $50,000 per capita, and the poor nations here in sub-Saharan Africa. So there's Kenya that we saw earlier, but here's DR Congo, for instance, and there's Burundi. These are nations that have that are in the neighborhood of about $1,000 per capita per year. Okay. And you might look at that picture and say that, okay, so what we're basically saying is that the difference between the richest and the poorest nations of the world is probably the order of magnitude is probably about 50 or so. Okay, like the US, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, you're talking about 50 and change in thousands. The poorest nations are about 1,000. But that would be a fallacy, because you're not actually seeing a continuous distribution of numbers here. You're seeing buckets, right? So these buckets actually mask a lot of heterogeneity in actually how rich or poor a nation is. So here is a table showing the 5 richest and the 5 poorest nations in 2023. They're the 5 richest nations. They're all nations that have GDP per capita over $50,000. But as you can see, they're decidedly larger than 50,000, right? So, and these are all non-oil producing nations. If you put some oil producing nations like Qatar, for instance, it would have a GDP per capita of over 160,000. But I just omitted the oil producing nations. So if we take a country like Luxembourg, 140,000 or so in that neighborhood, the poorest nations of the world, all in sub-Saharan Africa, have GDP per capita in the neighborhood of the low 1000s. So when you look at that factor of a difference, okay, you basically end up with numbers that say that, when I compare the richest and the poorest nations of the world, okay, the rich are richer by a factor of about 140. Okay, that's astounding, right? To be in the 21st century, okay, and to be in a world of such inequity seems astounding, right? And almost, inhumanly so, right? And so the question is then, where does this come from, right? How did the world come to be this way? Was it always this way, right? Were we always in a situation where there were rich countries and poor countries, and were these differences between the rich and poor so large? So it turns out that in order to answer the question, you can look at, actually, before I get to the answer to that question, let me show you this other picture, which gives us another impression of the nature or the extent of global inequity between countries. So this picture is based on a thought experiment that is due to the Dutch economist by the name of Jan Pen, okay, and that thought experiment is called the Parade of World Income. Okay, and it goes as follows. Imagine you took the entire population of the world, okay, and you lined people up in a parade, okay, where at the front of the parade, and people were grouped according to the nations that they were citizens of. And at the front of the parade, okay, you represented the poorest nations, and the parade was sorted going from people from the poorest nations all the way to people from the richest nations in the back, okay? And you were here standing at a podium or something like that, and you were watching the parade go by, and as the parade goes by, okay, you basically keep a record of what is the GDP per capita of the people of the country that the people are coming from, okay? So as you're maintaining the ticker, that's the percentage of the world population that is crossing you as the parade is moving along, right? Now you can see there are a few interesting patterns that kind of emerge over here. So initially, you're going to get a lot of people from the poorest nations of the world. These are smaller nations with smaller populations in say, sub-Saharan Africa, but nonetheless extremely poor. And those nations will capture about 10 to 15% of the world population. Still a significant number, right? Sort of maybe up to 20%. About a fifth of the world population lives in very, very poor nations. Now, after that, I mean, once you get to a point where you have, this long line over there is representing the population of one very, very large country. Anyone want to hazard a guess as to what nation that represents? So it will account for about a fifth of the world population, but not quite. So there are 2 nations that will account for a fifth each. Yeah.
China and India.
China and India, exactly. Okay, so the lower one there is India. Okay, and once India crosses by, there are a few more middle-income countries that come in, and then that other long stretch over there is China. Okay. Now, what I want you guys to notice from this picture is that this dashed line over here represents the average GDP per capita for the entire world. Okay, so that is if I took the entire global population, okay, and I looked at total world income and divided it by that population, the number I would get is about $19,000, okay, $19,000 and change, okay, as the average of the income of the average person in the world, okay. But what is really telling about this picture is that about 80% of the world's population will have passed you by before I even hit that average. Okay, so 80%, 4/5 of the world's population, okay, is earning income that is below average. That's remarkable, right? That's when you think about it, that's an astounding level of inequity, right? Where, and now once you get past 80%, okay, now you start getting sort of the giants creeping in, okay? Countries with very small populations, okay, but very, very rich, right? So you can see how the cliff starts to emerge, and it starts to emerge really quickly. That flat line over there at the very end, close to the very end, okay, that represents about, the 280 million people in the US, okay? And then there are a few other countries like the Luxembourgs and the Singapores of the world with smaller populations that have even higher GDP per capita. So that's the state of global inequality, okay, and how it's captured by this parade of world income. Now, how did we get to this state? So if you look at the evolution of income, okay, of GDP per capita over a longer stretch of time, okay, what I'm plotting here is the path of GDP per capita over a period of maybe about going back to the early 19th century. And I'm plotting different country groups and in some cases individual countries. The top two lines over there represents the US and the UK. The bottom line over here, the one in the solid blue, represents China. The line in light blue over here represents Japan. So there are a lot of interesting facts that emerge in this picture. You can spend hours on this picture and think a lot about global inequality and how it has changed over time. So a few things kind of jump out. So there's the US and UK economy. So they are kind of they're the economic frontier of the world, right? They were that way even going back to the early 19th century. Okay, but they maintained this constant rate of growth over a long period of time, and they continue to remain close to the economic. They continue to remain at the economic frontier even in contemporary times. There are other countries like Japan that were that started off much poorer, started to grow in the late 19th century, was devastated by the ravages of the Second World War, but then entered a period of rapid growth and what we call catch-up growth. Okay, that nations like Japan were able to catch up to the frontier and join the rich group of nations so to speak. Patterns here for the developed countries. You can see there's the Great Depression. Okay, there's the post-World War boom. So those are like big swings, macroeconomic swings in the U.S. economy. But what is really telling when you look at this picture on the long view is that these advanced nations like the U.S. and UK, those big macro swings that that gets talked about a lot in policy circles, really gets washed out by the long trend, right? What you see is this consistent trend of growth that is happening in the advanced nations, right? Whereas the poorer countries, many of them are stagnating for long periods of time. That's China, all the way until 1970, and then China kind of emerges on a period of rapid growth after the 70s, and particularly starting in the 80s, due to market liberalization policies that were implemented by Deng Xiaoping. And obviously modern China has been growing at pretty high rates. So China, you can see here, has been experiencing something that Japan experienced back in the 60s and in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, this phenomenon of kind of catch-up growth. And then there are kind of other nations here. The one here in the dashed line over here is Africa, and here Africa it really does seem like a story of stagnation, right? There are spurts or periods of growth, but those are negated by other periods of decline, and on average it seems more like a wash. You're not really seeing a lot of improvement in GDP per capita. Now, the other thing I want you guys to take from this graph is that this is measured in a log scale, okay? So each jump here in big units, that's a jump by a factor of 10. It's a log base 10 scale, okay? So, some of the vast differences that I talked about earlier, okay? Those are the gaps between the richest and the poorest regions of the world, okay? So those are pretty big gaps. Now, if you go back to the early 19th century, those gaps were much smaller. The difference between here, that's the US and the UK, had a GDP per capita of less than about 2,000, okay? And the poorest nations, okay, had a GDP per capita of about 1,000. So what used to be about a factor of 2, okay, in the period of what I'll call the Industrial Revolution, okay, turns into something that is a factor of about 50, 60, 140 in modern times. Okay, so global inequities are a relatively recent phenomenon. Okay, I mean, the world used to be an impoverished place, but going back to the period of the Industrial Revolution and before, but it was more equal. People were on average everywhere equally impoverished, right? So then the question of where global inequalities come from today, you can see is intricately tied, okay, to the growth process. There are some nations that were able to embark on a period of sustained economic growth, and were therefore able to really pull ahead of the rest, right? So these are the US, the UK's, the nations of Western Europe, and the like, Japan as well, and many of the East Asian tiger economies. And then there are other nations that are struggling to embark on that kind of on that process of sustained growth, right? So the story of global inequities, as we think about them, at least as far as global inequities between countries is concerned, seems to be one where the answers are to be found in these differential trajectories of economic growth, okay, and how these differential trajectories come about. Okay, so that's the first point I wanted to kind of broad point that I wanted to make with this initial set of slides. Now, the one last point, I'm going to skip that slide. I think it's more on the technical side. I'm going to talk very briefly about this one. So this is another cut at the data on global inequality. It covers a similar time frame as the earlier picture that I showed you guys, starting in about 1820. So this is based on data and research that was done by researchers at the World Bank. And what this data does, it says that, look, suppose I looked at income differences, okay, for the entire world population, or for the entire population for which we have data. And I asked the following question, like, there is, when I look at differences in material well-being, differences in income between individuals, okay, there is going to be one component of those differences that will come from inequality within countries, okay, sort of like, inequality, the differences between rich and the poor in a given nation, right? And then there's another component of those differences that are going to come. Okay, so when I compare a rich Swede versus a poor Swede, if there is such a thing as a poor Swede, that would pick up the within country inequality. Okay, but if I compared, the average Swede with the average person from Sierra Leone, okay, that would pick up, okay, a between country inequality, right? So on average, when I look at all of world inequality, I can kind of decompose it to ask the question, how much of total world inequality is coming about as a result of disparities in economic opportunities within nations versus how much of it is coming about as a result of differences between nations, okay? And how does that breakdown change over time? And so what this picture tells us is the following. It says that, if I went back to the period of the Industrial Revolution, so early 19th century, much of total inequality, sort of the total world inequality is the solid line over there. And the component of total inequality that is due to inequality within nations is the dashed line. And so what this picture tells you is that early in the 19th century, almost all of global inequality was due to within country inequality. The gap, the vertical distance between those two lines tells us how much between country inequality was. Okay? And it was actually very small, right? It was only in the past, say, 200 and 250 years, 230 years, that the total world inequality has gone up, and it has gone up quite a bit, and almost all of that increase in total world inequality is as a result of differences between rich nations and poor nations. Okay, the inequality that is due to the within country component is relatively stagnant. Okay, so much of global inequality comes about really as a result of the first picture that I showed. Is really associated with that first picture that I showed, the differences between Lower Manhattan and Kibera slum. Okay. All right, so then the question is, like, what are the forces that lead to this? I'm going to take a quick look at the time. What are the forces that lead to this? Now, growth economists like myself, we spend a lot of time thinking about what are the factors or what are the forces that bring about high growth in some countries and moderate or modest or even very low rates of economic growth in other countries. Okay, so and by economic growth, I'm referring to the percentage increase in GDP per capita from one year to the next. Okay, so so now researchers approaching this question will tend to put will the intellectual tradition here has been that researchers in this area will tend to put these different sources of growth into different buckets. Okay, sort of just to keep our thoughts organized. Okay, now the first category of sources of growth are what we call proximate sources. Okay, so these are things that economies do or agents in an economy will do in order to improve the economy's capacity to produce and consume more. Okay, so things that an economy can accumulate more of in order to improve its productive capacity. Okay, in order to improve its ability to produce more GDP. Okay, that's the idea. Okay, and within this bucket of proximate sources, okay, we have like two broad categories. One is what we call factor accumulation, and the other one is what we call productivity. And I'll walk you guys through each of these. So let's talk about factor accumulation. Now, factor accumulation will include a few different things. The first thing the first and perhaps most famous that we talk about in sort of undergraduate theories of economic growth is physical capital. What do I mean by physical capital? Machines, tools, okay? The sort of the things that workers work with, the physical stuff that workers work with, the tools that they work with in order to make them more productive than they otherwise would be, okay? This is true of an industrial economy, like what I have in this picture, but it can be true of any economy. You can think about hunter-gatherer societies and, where, you have hunting tools, spears or whatever. Those are a form of capital that is interacting with the hunter, which is the labor, right? And the hunter is much more productive because, they have a spear to be able to work with. They can hunt more as a result, right? So that's capital improving worker productivity, okay? In the same way that, sort of machinery along a production line improves the productivity of workers along that line, right? So the idea here then is that countries that are able to have more of these tools, okay, in per worker terms, right, where the average worker in a country has more tools at his or her disposal to be able to work with, will be more productive, and as a result will be able to generate more income, okay, produce more stuff, right? And when we look at the data, so this is a scatter plot showing, where each point in the plot is a country, and I'm going to be showing you guys a bunch of these types of plots. But this plot basically shows how that there is, you can see on the x-axis GDP per worker, so that's income generated per worker, and on the y-axis you have capital per worker, sort of these tools and machines that workers on average in each country have to work with. And you see a very clear, strong, positive relationship, right? Countries over here, like the US, that have high levels of GDP per worker, where workers are very productive, are also countries where workers have a lot of machines that they can work with at their disposal, right? Poorer nations, okay, there's Burundi, the poorest nation of the world that I showed you in the table, okay, also has the least amount of capital per worker, okay? So having more physical capital is an important thing for economic growth. The more tools, the more machines workers on average have to work with, okay, the more productive they are, and therefore the more they can contribute to the wealth of the nation. Right? Now where do these tools come from? They don't drop out of the sky. We call these tools capital goods. Okay, so machines, spears, cooking utensils, whatever it is you want to call them, right? They're all forms of capital goods. Where do they come from? They come from what we call investments. Okay, they when people generate income, they earn from supplying their labor to the labor force. Not all that income gets consumed. Okay, not all of that income gets spent on goods and services. Some part of it is set aside in savings. Okay, now what happens to those savings? Okay, those savings eventually return to the person saving them in the form of principal payments with interest, right? But the bank that the savings is sitting on, isn't going to be sitting on those funds, right? The bank is going to act like a conduit. It's going to take those funds, okay, and loan them out to entrepreneurs. Okay? And what entrepreneurs will do is they'll come up with productive investment ideas, entrepreneurial projects, okay, for which they're going to need to purchase capital goods in order to give their workers tools to work with, right? So those capital goods are going to be then financed, okay, by the savings of households, all right? So in countries where you have, where households are able to where households and firms as well, there's something that we call retained earnings of firms, which is a form of savings on the part of firms. In countries where households and firms are able to save a larger fraction of their income, are also countries, okay, where we say are countries with high saving rates, and therefore those are countries where the banking sector can actually sort of provide much more loanable funds for entrepreneurs to be able to conduct investments in new capital goods, okay? So, you know, presumably countries like the US and other rich countries that have a lot of capital per worker are also countries where there's a lot of entrepreneurial investment going on. Why? Because the saving rates are generally high. Okay? And indeed, that's what we see in the data. Okay, so you know, here what I have in this plot is countries sort of divided into different into one of 10 buckets. The buckets are ranked by how rich going from the poorest bucket of countries to the richest bucket of countries, and then the height of each bar represents what the saving rate is, what is the proportion of income that is set aside in savings on average by countries in each bucket. And you can see that in the richest 10% of countries, okay, the average saving rate is about 37% or so. Okay, so 37% of income per worker, okay, is not consumed, is set aside in savings, and so that is the amount of loanable funds that then becomes available for entrepreneurs to be able to invest in and produce more capital, right? The lowest, the poorest 10% of countries are places where only 5% of income is able to be put aside into savings. Okay, so the savings behavior and the investment behavior of the economy is important for capital accumulation. All right. So it turns out, however, that capital accumulation at the amount of physical capital in the economy itself it cannot be the entire explanation. I'm going to skip this slide in the interest of time. There are other factors that also matter for growth. One is population growth, demographics, right? And the way that you want to think about how demographics is going to affect the process of economic growth is that population growth is going to be a force that dilutes how many productive resources each worker will have at their disposal, okay, in order to be able to produce stuff, right? So, if you think about, how many tools each worker has at their disposal, okay, we know that more tools per worker means more income that the worker can generate because the worker is more productive. Okay, now, if you think about a situation where, the amount of tools in the economy, okay, is growing, but the amount of workers in the economy is growing faster. Okay, so you have the amount of tools divided by the amount of workers. Okay, so you have growth in the quantity of tools, that's capital accumulation, and then you have growth in the quantities of workers, which is population growth, right? Suppose population growth is faster than growth in capital. What happens to the ratio? The denominator is growing faster than the numerator, the ratio drops, right? So what that means is that each worker, as a result of population growth, okay, has less tools at his or her disposal in order to be able to generate income with, okay? Which means that as a corollary of the earlier relationship that I showed, we should observe that countries where there's higher population growth are also countries where income per capita or GDP per capita is lower, right? And that is indeed what we see in the data. There are some exceptions, but in general, poorer nations, in terms of their GDP per capita, okay, have much higher population growth rates. So in this case, I'm plotting the annual rate of population growth on the y-axis, and what we're seeing here is that population growth rate is associated with lower levels of GDP per capita. The richer nations, with the exception of the oil-producing nations of the Middle East, but setting those aside, the richer nations here, all with high levels of GDP per capita, all generally have lower rates of population growth. Why? Because this dilution effect, okay, is not as strong in the richer nations as it is in the poorer nations where population growth Now, okay, so we've talked about physical capital, we've talked about population growth. It turns out that even, that's not the entire story either. There are other things that are important. Okay, one of the other things that's important is not just the quantity of workers, okay, which comes in population growth, but also the quality of workers. Okay, and by worker qualities, I'm referring to things like the health and nutritional status of workers. Okay, where poor health or malnutrition or shorter life expectancies, okay, can all be associated with lower worker productivity, right? Also, qualities like education, right? The level of education of workers, okay, whether a worker has basic literacy and numeracy skills, right, or has more than that, right? Has secondary school education, has tertiary schooling, and so on and so forth. All are things that presumably are going to be important for making workers more productive than others, right? So worker health, education levels of workers, how much job training workers have. Firms in the economy will spend considerable amounts of resources in order to train and retrain their workers. What they're really doing is investing in their workers as human capital, right? Making them more productive than they otherwise would be. So countries of the world where we observe better health and nutritional status of workers, where we observe higher average years of schooling amongst workers, okay, are also countries that we associate with higher levels of human capital. And therefore, if human capital is important for worker productivity, we should also see that these also happen to be the richer countries of the world, right? And that's indeed what we see in the data. So this is a scatter plot showing the relationship across countries between GDP per capita on the x-axis, okay, and the daily per capita consumption of calories, okay? And what you end up seeing is that countries where you can think about that measure as a measure of the nutritional status, okay, of people in the economy, and countries that are richer, okay, have higher levels of health human capital, okay, and countries that are poorer, these are all sub-Saharan African nations, countries that are poorer tend to have much poorer nutritional status. And we think those things matter, obviously, because malnourished people are unable to be as productive, okay, in terms of their labor supply. Another important indicator of population health is the length of life. Okay, so life expectancy at birth. The places where population health is considered to be at high levels are places where the life expectancy at birth is quite high, is quite long. So these are all the rich nations of the world, okay, that have much higher population health. Life expectancies there are at birth are about 85 years. In the poorest nations of the world, okay, life expectancy at places like, say the Central African Republic or Nigeria, it's almost 30 years less, okay, in expectations of life. That's it's really staggering. Okay, the average person in CAR expects to live 30 years of a shorter lifespan than the average person in a place like Norway or Hong Kong. Now, the other form of human capital comes from education. Countries that are, what I'm plotting on this axis is the average years of schooling amongst the working population. Countries that are richer have workers that have much more education than countries that are poor. Okay? And we think that this relationship is at least partly reflective of the fact that better educated workers are more productive and therefore able to generate higher income in their respective economies. Okay, so that's factor accumulation. Now, wow, I'm burning through time here, so I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. I'm going to skip that. Let me talk about sort of the other sort of arm of the proximate sources of growth. Now, the other arm, setting aside human capital, physical capital, and population growth, the other arm of these proximate sources, what we refer to as productivity. Okay, and I'll give you guys some examples of precisely what I mean by productivity. But let me show you some quick data. I'm only going to pick out a couple of countries here. Okay, so what I'm plotting. Okay, oops, sorry. what I'm listing here are different countries of the world, okay, with the United States on top. What I'm listing here are 3 columns: the income per worker in each country, how much physical and human capital each worker has in that country, and then I have a 3rd column, which I'm calling productivity, that is going to be inferred by the first 2 numbers. Now, the United States in this table is my benchmark country, so everything is normalized to 1 for the United States. Okay, so let's compare the United States with Canada, for instance. Okay, so this number 0.77 for Canada's income per worker basically says that Canada's income per worker is 77% of the US level. Okay, so it is lower than the US level. Okay, if for every dollar that the US earns, okay, Canada only earns about 77 cents. Okay, that's so Canada is about 33 cents poorer, okay, than the US. Okay, that's the way to think about it. Now look at Canada's factor endowments. Its physical and human capital per worker, okay, are 0.99 the US level. Okay, so Canada has 99%, okay, of the physical and human capital endowment that the US does. Okay, but yet its income per worker is noticeably smaller. Okay, what explains that difference? Okay, it's not the quantity of machines, how well educated or how well nourished the workers are. Both Canada and the US have low levels of population growth, so that's not the answer either. So what is the difference that is generating that gap? Okay, for Canada being, sort of 30 cents on the dollar or 23 cents on the dollar. It's been a long day, sorry guys. 23 cents on the dollar poorer than the US. Well, it has to do with something else, okay? And that something else is what I'm going to call productivity, okay? And the way economists think about productivity is to say that, well, Canada has the same level of physical and human capital per worker as the US does. It's just that it is not utilizing, okay, that physical and human capital as well as the US is. Okay, and therefore it is the fact that Canada is utilizing its physical and human capital endowment less effectively is what is resulting in it having lower income per worker. Now, what are the things that affect utilization? I'm going to skip those graphs. The first is going to be technology. Okay, that technology is, I'm going to think about it as the innovative ideas that are embedded in tools or in blueprints that are generated through investments in research and development by firms in the economy. And these are things that are going to make both capital and workers more productive than they otherwise would be. Okay, so the US is more productive than Canada. Okay, and in part because it potentially has more advanced technologies that it is working with than Canada is. Okay, that's one explanation. Okay, and indeed, when I extrapolate that to other countries of the world, what I see is that here what I'm plotting here on the y-axis is expenditures undertaken by firms in each country on research and development. Okay, and research, you should think about research and development as the process of investment through which firms are developing new technologies or figuring out ways to adopt advanced technologies that were developed elsewhere. Okay, and in places of the world where firms are doing more of this research and development, okay, are also places of the world that are richer. Okay, poorer places of the world do a lot less research and development. So technology is one explanation for differences in productivity that we observe across countries. I'm going to skip that part. The other one is going to be what I'll call economic efficiency. Okay, and what economic efficiency captures is the following concept, that it captures situations where free and fair market competition results in a more effective use of the economy's productive resources. Okay, so this this can come about as in a variety of ways, but whenever there is lack of market competition, okay, what that could mean is that the productive resources of the economy, like physical and human capital, okay, are being locked into uses that are not making full utilization of their true productive power. Okay, one example could be something like a monopolist in a market. Okay, a monopoly has market power. Okay, is kind of excluding competition, has the market power to be able to exclude competition, right? And but because there is no competition that is faced, the monopolist does not have any incentive to innovate really, and is kind of charging whatever price the monopolist wishes to charge, and is kind of employing workers and capital with these inefficient technologies, okay, that are not unleashing the full productive power of the machines of the workers that the firm has. Okay, so that's one example of inefficiency, okay, as a result of the lack of free and fair competition. That another example comes from trade. Okay, so countries that have barriers to international trade, okay, are basically countries that are trying to shelter themselves from international competition. Okay, and as a result, what is happening is that the country's resources, okay, its physical and human capital resources, are not being utilized in the sectors in which the country is inherently good at. Okay, that when free competition opens up, that forces each country to kind of focus in the sectors or in the type of activities that each country is inherently good at. Okay, and then if country A is really good at producing apples and country B is really good at producing oranges, okay, in a world where they don't trade with each other, both country A and country B have to produce both apples and oranges because that's what consumers want, right? But in a world where there is open trade, country A can be focused on just producing apples and produce a lot of it, and country B can just be focused on producing oranges and produce a lot of it, and then they can trade with each other. Okay, so it just makes the global pie go up, okay, and each country's share of that pie go up as well. Okay, so that's another example of efficiency, and indeed we see this in the data that countries where there's a much higher openness to international trade because there are lower barriers, okay, to international trade, there are lower tariffs, okay, and there are lower things like lower barriers like import quotas and such, are also countries where GDP per capita is much higher. Okay, the poorer nations of the world with lower GDP per capita are much more closed. Okay, they impose a lot of protections. Okay, against foreign competition. And we think that at least part of this is reflective of the inefficiency that results in poorer nations as a result of high barriers to international trade. Okay, so I'm running out of time, but I want to. Wow, I'm already past my 45 minutes. Let me make a couple of more points, which and talk about fundamental sources of growth. I'm going to go very quickly over this. I won't show you guys any scatter plots, and maybe we can leave some time in Q&A and discussion in case folks are interested, and we can talk about the fundamental sources. But when I'm thinking about the fundamental sources of growth, what researchers will talk about are preconditions, okay, within an economy, okay, that affect incentives within the economy to engage in productive investments. Okay, so one of the things that I've shown you guys in the previous parts of the talk is that anything that is good for growth requires some sort of an investment. You need to have investment in capital goods in order to have more capital in the economy. You need to have investments in education or investments in population health, right? In order to have more human capital in the economy. If you want to improve the technological environment, okay, for technologies that firms are working with, well, they need to invest in research and development expenditures, right? So these are all expenditures not on things that we eat, okay, but these are expenditures on things that make people in the economy more productive than they otherwise would be, okay? And that additional income that they generate is the return on those investments, okay? Now, these things are driven by incentives. I'm only going to ever invest, okay, for the future if I know that the return on that investment is going to accrue back to me, okay? Because the investment entails a sacrifice on my part today. I'm not eating all of my income. I'm setting some of it aside for a higher future income, right? So there needs to be some guarantee that that higher future income will accrue to me in the future. It will accrue to me. Now, what are those guarantees, if you will, right? These guarantees are few and far between, but those things come from, the institutional structure in the economy. Okay, so government, okay, plays a very, very fundamental role. Okay, basically, one of the fundamental tasks of governance is the administration of the rule of law. Okay, and by administering the rule of law, if it does so credibly and if it does so well, then the government is going to be securing private property rights, okay, if I open up a bank account and there's an interest rate that is promised to me on that bank account, well, the bank better sort of like meet me on that contract. If there's a violation of that contract, okay, then there's going to be some other agent in the economy, the government, that will enforce it, okay, or is going to back it up, right? So that's one of the roles of government, is enforcing contracts, okay? The other role is securing property rights, the titling of the assets that we own, right? The land, the homes, the firms that we own and that we invest in, right? If somebody else can come and expropriate that away from us, then there's the incentive to engage in investments into those types of assets in order to improve their value and to make them more productive will be gone, right? So the quality of government is fundamentally important, okay, for economic growth. So unfortunately, due to the lack of time, I'm going to skip all of that, and maybe we can come back to other questions. The other fundamental source of growth is going to be geography, okay? And by geography, I mean the natural characteristics of a nation that affect its ability to engage in trade. So countries that are landlocked, countries that don't have access to sea navigable rivers, are going to be countries that are going to find it very difficult to engage in international trade, okay? Because freight costs over land are way more expensive than freight costs over water. Right? So not having access to those types of geographical features naturally restrict certain countries from being able to engage in efficiency gains from international trade that I talked about before. Some countries are not going to be blessed with agriculturally very productive lands, right? And as a result, the value added from agricultural activities will be much lower in those countries. Countries that are in the tropics, okay, will often be exposed to tropical disease environments like malaria, right? Sort of the climate in those countries have ecologies that are particularly conducive to vectors of diseases, so mosquito-borne illnesses like malaria and yellow fever, dengue. These are all fevers that generate a lot of morbidity in the economy. Some of them have high mortality rates as well, but what that does is that in an environment where there's a high incidence of those diseases, it diminishes the incentive to engage in human capital. Okay, high levels of morbidity make workers less productive. It also makes students less productive and in terms of how much they can learn in the classroom. Right. So disease environments hamper the accumulation of human capital. Right? Okay. So I'm already well over time. I promised that I would leave at least some time for discussion. So I had a few other things to talk about, and delving into each of these mechanisms through which government and geography can affect the incentives of individuals in the economy to engage in productive investments. But let me just go to the very end and sort of just to tie it all up. I'm not going to get a chance to talk much about policies. But let me show you guys the progress that the world has made in terms of perhaps narrowing some of the gaps in wealth and income that I talked about earlier. So much of what I've talked about so far, the structure for thinking about economic growth has informed a lot of policy making in low-income countries, in emerging market economies, in order to improve the standard of living, in order to improve income per worker in those countries over the past few decades. And some of those policy measures those reforms have actually generated returns. So here is a picture showing the global income distribution. So you should think what I have here on the x-axis is yearly income per person. And the height of the graph in each case represents the share of the world population, okay, that earns that a given level of income. Okay, so and then that share is then broken up based on which countries that population come from. Okay, so what you can see from here is that there are kind of two clubs of countries. There's sort of a poorer club of countries, and there's a richer club of countries, right? Back in 1988, the poorer club of countries had average income that was pretty much at the international poverty line, okay? The rich club of countries was out there. Now, as a result of policies that happened in many low-income and emerging market economies, Okay, if these policies are successful, what we should observe is that the mass over here should be slowly shifting over to the right, okay? And which is indeed what we see. Okay, so this is the picture on the same data, but as of 1998. This is the picture of the same data as of 2008. And what you can see is that the bottom mass, okay, is slowly kind of shifting up to the right. So you can think about that as reflecting the fact that a lot of people in lower income countries are no longer in lower income countries. They're being lifted out of poverty, okay, and as such, there's some amount of catch up in living conditions that is taking place, right? So that's good news. That's good news for the problem of economic development and growth, right? This is some reduction in global inequity. This is the same picture in 2011. Okay, so you can see that, for instance, China has played a big part of the role in that catch-up, right, as a result of the remarkable growth that it has experienced in the past 30 years. But observe that despite all of that growth, right, you still have a large mass of people in the world, okay, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, this is in the Middle East, a lot of India, a large mass of people in the world that are still living in squalor, well below the international poverty line, which is $456 per year per person, okay? So despite progress having been made, there is still much work left to be done. Many of these countries, and I'll end with this point, countries in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, some countries in South Asia, including India, of course, are countries that are particularly vulnerable to some challenges that lay ahead, including challenges of climate change, the rise of sea levels, the loss of coastal alluvial plains as a result of that. These are also countries where there's a lot of political strife and political volatility, social volatility. So as resources become more limited as a result of climate change, these are countries where we expect there to be a lot of conflict and state fragility as a result because of destabilization of an already unstable political environment. So these are going to leave vast swaths of the world population, okay, in an uncertain state. So despite progress being done in certain margins, I'm just going to end with this point. There's still much work left to be done in terms of global development policy. And I'm sorry for having taken so long. Maybe we can take a few minutes extra for additional questions. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Just to mention again, like from our convocation committee, thanks to Dr. Ashraf for accepting our invitation and coming here, and thank you all for finding some time and you took interest to attend this talk. So thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And still, we have some time if you have time. If any questions you want to ask. So those of you who have time, yeah, please.
How do you anticipate the withdrawal of U.S. soft power, particularly WHO, USAID,
yes,
things like that, affecting global income distributions in the next 10 years?
Okay, excellent question. Obviously, this is a question on many people's minds in international development, in the international development space. It does impose challenges, right? In the sense that, I think, you see, I mean, the motivation behind it is in part the fact that that a lot of a lot of international support can lead to perverse incentives, right? So the idea oftentimes being that if you're going to one of the worries that I think donor countries often have, right? And this has been the case not just in recent times. This is an issue that goes back decades, right? I mean, even to the inception of multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, that makes a lot of loans to developing countries. Economic theory talks about things like perverse incentives, right? If you have, it's kind of like the bailout problem, right? If you know that there's going to be somebody out there to bail you out, then you might not be incentivized to do a very good job to begin with, right? So the idea has always been like, and this is one of the things that donor countries and donor organizations have often worried with is that, if we engage in donating and providing aid assistance, development assistance, etc., at what point does it introduce the incentives that the recipient countries are not using those funds in an efficient enough way. So that I think is one of the motivations, at least, of the recent happenings in this space. You see, the flip side of it is that there are a lot of this work that has been going on. It's really work at much of it is really of humanitarian concern, right? As opposed to, I would say, strategic development concern, right? I think a lot of the work that the Agency for International, the USAID Agency for International Development, has been doing is kind of partnering with local think tanks, non-government organizations, in order to promote sort of development in a very grassroots type of way, right? Sort of, one classic example in the context of Bangladesh, where I'm from, is where microfinance was developed. So, and microfinance, obviously, it basically is lending to the poor, right? Sort of those who don't have sufficient collateral to be able to take out large loans. The idea is very, very simple: give them small loans, but allow them to do something with that credit. And it turns out that, at least in certain parts of the world, in Bangladesh, it was very successful. In other parts, it wasn't. That it really works. When people are able to utilize it well, poor people are able to utilize it well, get the capital that they need, come up with a productive business idea, generate income as a result of it, repay that loan with interest, and still keep a pie to take home. A lot of that work, the outreach for that work really comes about from sort of the international donor agency working with sort of organizations at the grassroots level in order to implement, right, the allocation of those funds, right? So there is actually a lot of economic empowerment that was happening, which is now going to be, that umbilical cord is now basically severed, right? So, so I think, when it comes to this space, as a result of the umbilical cord being severed, I think it's kind of created like somewhat of a vacuum. And I think more of the private donor organizations are coming to play. I think donor organizations from Europe and other developed parts of the world, Japan, are sort of, they're not going to fill up the vacuum. It's a large space that, as a result of the pullout. But some of it I think, is going to be moderated, if you will, by the fact that new players, or old players who weren't playing as much of a larger role before, are going to try to keep, or rebuild a new umbilical cord in order for that type of work to continue. So, good question. I guess the short answer is, it's certainly going to have an effect, but hopefully it won't have as much of an adverse effect as many in international development fear it will. Great question. Yes.
It's a very simple question. What's holding India back?
What's holding India back? In the context of India, you see, I think India has had a very, unlike China, which has taken very much sort of a manufacturing-driven approach to development. It's a very sort of physical, early, sort of China of the 80s was very much kind of like a market liberalization kind of a thing. There was still very much an agricultural economy, but what happened was that it moved away from a lot of the communist kind of central planning interventionist kind of model, right? It said that, look, we're still going to be an agricultural economy, but we're going to back out. We're going to allow more sort of privatized incentives to kind of play a role. And and they got a lot, and they saw that it really worked. Like farming communities were way more productive as a result, because it turned out that if you allow farmers to keep a share of some of the proceeds after they sell on the market, guess what? They're going to do a really good job tilling the land and investing fertilizers in it, because they get some of the returns from the seeds that they sow. And that model then basically fell, sort of fed into sort of a model that that worked really well in the East Asian tiger economies, like South Korea, for instance, and Malaysia, where those economies that embarked on industrialization in the 70s did so under these very liberal, kind of more under kind of liberalized kind of markets. And sort of China replicated that. It just did it 2 decades later and did it at a much larger scale, right? So it's still very much a physical capital in industry-driven kind of engine of growth. Despite China now having released sort of a competitor to ChatGPT, and from what I hear, potentially even a superior one to that, we don't really think about China as a technological frontier. It's still very much, an industry-driven kind of economy. With India, it's been more interesting. It's not, we don't really think about India as a large-scale industry-driven model of development. I think what has happened in India is, it has kind of made the jump towards doing a lot of service sector-driven development. So IT has been a big one, and the financial industry has been a big one. There is quite a bit of industry there too, but it's not large scale, not in the same way that what China did. So there's still a lot of agriculture that's happening in India. Much of India's economy is still very much agricultural, right? And it turns out that there hasn't been sort of as much sort of technology or productivity improvements in that sector, right? That what China did was basically to say we'll just we'll depend less on agriculture and we'll focus much more on industry, and we'll expand industry with a lot of good productivity, with good technologies, more efficient markets and things like that. But in India, still very much, a lot of it is still agriculture dependent. And I think it's sort of the reliance on agriculture and kind of the old kind of market institutions for agriculture, which have been modernizing, but have been doing so at a much slower pace. It's also one of the reasons why India, despite in experiencing some growth in GDP per capita over the last 2-3 decades, has also experienced increasing inequality. Sort of like there's the differences between the rich and the poor within India is much larger today than it was in the 1980s. So I think that's the way that I kind of think about its reliance on kind of more the old institutionalized agriculture that continues to.
If I just may add quickly, I'm not sure though, but the whole class structure in India, the class system, social structure, that could be a big impediment for India's growth, because after 1990s, they were doing much better. And so, the old class system in India, it is still, they're paying price for it.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's a big impediment.
Absolutely. Yeah, so one of the ways in which I think this plays a role is that, so when we think about it as growth economists, is that something like the caste system, basically it's exclusionary, right? Only it's kind of like the feudal systems of like, medieval Europe, right? Only certain people could do certain things, right? And basically whatever, there's not a lot of social mobility. Whatever you're born into is what you are kind of destined to do for the rest of your life. That's very much true, continues to be true within the caste system in India, right? And one of the things that results from that is it's inefficiency because there's misallocation of talent, right? Because talent can crop up anywhere. This goes back to the kind of the human capital stuff I was talking about, and the fact that culture can sometimes be an impediment to an efficient allocation of talent, right? If a poor person or somebody having been born in a poor family is actually really talented, doesn't have the collateral to take out a loan to go to college and get a really good education and get the highest paying job in the country. But if there is social mobility, then the market should be able to recognize that person's talent and say that, hey, look, you should be able to take this loan out, go to college, because you have all the ability to repay it with interest and contribute to the economy, right? But if you're going to be stuck in this kind of environment where it says that, hey, look, you're coming from this caste, you don't qualify for a loan, you can't even get into the bank, that's the inefficiency and the misallocation that results. So some of that is certainly happening in India.
Well, I think we need to stop here, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nice to have a bit of time. Thank you.
Of course. We're going for a lot of stuff. I know, thank you, Mateo. Hopefully it was amazing.
She told me I was like,